You know what keeps medical students up at night? Those tricky inflammation questions that show up in every major exam. Today, we're breaking down the most tested inflammation topics in NEET PG, FMGE, and INICET, and turning your biggest exam nightmare into your secret weapon.
And trust me, understanding these patterns is absolutely crucial. From acute inflammation to granulomas, these topics consistently appear in every exam cycle.
So let's dive right in. What are the most frequently tested areas in inflammation?
Well, based on the previous year questions from 2020 to 2025, acute inflammation and its mediators take the crown. They appear in roughly 30% of all inflammation-related questions.
That's a significant chunk. What specific aspects should students focus on?
The vascular events and cellular events in acute inflammation are absolute goldmines. Questions about margination, rolling, adhesion, and diapedesis are particularly common.
Ah, the classic cascade. But I've heard there's been a shift in how these questions are asked.
Exactly. Recent exams have moved away from direct recall questions to more clinical scenario-based ones. For instance, questions about LED defects often present as cases of delayed umbilical cord separation.
That's fascinating. So students need to connect their basic concepts to clinical presentations.
Absolutely. And here's something interesting. The special stain questions are becoming increasingly popular. Like, did you know toluidine blue is specifically used for mast cells and basophils?
Oh, really? That's exactly the kind of detail that could show up in an exam.
Right. And speaking of details, chemical mediators of inflammation are another hot topic. Questions about prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and platelet-activating factors appear frequently.
What about chronic inflammation? That seems like a massive topic.
It is, and it's particularly important for INICET. They love asking about granulomas, their types, composition, and associated diseases.
Can you break down the granuloma questions for us?
Sure, the lymphocytic collar composition, giant cell types, and the difference between caseating and non-caseating granulomas are frequently tested.
And what about wound healing? That's related to inflammation, right?
Yes, and it's another high-yield area. Questions often focus on the cells responsible for wound contraction and basement membrane degradation.
I've noticed the exam pattern has changed quite a bit since the pandemic.
That's true. There's been a shift towards more integrated questions that combine basic concepts with clinical applications.
How should students approach these integrated questions?
The key is to understand the underlying mechanisms. For example, when they ask about chemotaxis, they might present it as a case of recurrent infections.
That makes sense. What about image-based questions?
They're becoming increasingly common, especially in INICET. Students need to be familiar with the histological appearance of different types of inflammation.
Any specific images they should focus on?
Granulomas are the most commonly tested. Being able to distinguish between tuberculoid, sarcoid, and foreign body granulomas is crucial.
What about the molecular aspects of inflammation?
Yes, questions about inflammatory mediators and their mechanisms are very common. Understanding the COX pathway and cytokine cascades is essential.
That's quite complex. How should students approach this?
I recommend focusing on the clinical applications. For instance, understanding how COX inhibitors work helps answer questions about NSAIDs.
Speaking of clinical applications, what about drug-related questions?
They're very important. Questions about anti-inflammatory drugs, particularly their mechanisms and side effects, are frequently asked.
Any specific drugs they should focus on?
Xileuton and its effects on the leukotriene pathway is a favorite topic. Also, questions about glucocorticoids and their anti-inflammatory mechanisms.
Let's talk about exam strategy. How should students approach these questions?
First, read the last line of the question carefully. Often, the clinical presentation is described first, but the actual question is about the underlying mechanism.
That's a great tip. Any other strategic advice?
Yes, always look for key buzzwords in the question stem. Terms like delayed umbilical cord separation should immediately make you think of adhesion defects.
What about time management during the exam?
For inflammation questions, I recommend the 30-second rule. If you can't identify the key concept within 30 seconds, mark it for review and move on.
That's practical advice. What about preparation strategy?
Focus on solving previous year questions. The pattern tends to repeat, especially in NEET PG and INICET.
How many questions should students practice daily?
I recommend at least 30 MCQs daily, focusing on one subtopic at a time. Start with acute inflammation, then move to chronic, and so on.
What about resources? Any specific recommendations?
The question banks from recent years, particularly 2020-2025, are most relevant. They reflect the current exam pattern better.
How important are diagrams and flowcharts?
Very important, especially for understanding pathways like the complement cascade and coagulation cascade. They're frequently tested in image-based questions.
What about mnemonics? Are they helpful?
Yes, especially for remembering mediators and their functions. But don't rely too heavily on them. Understanding the concepts is more important.
Any common mistakes students should avoid?
The biggest mistake is memorizing without understanding. Questions are becoming more application-based, so conceptual clarity is crucial.
How should they approach revision?
Create a timeline-based chart of inflammation events. It helps connect acute and chronic inflammation concepts.
What about last-minute preparation?
Focus on high-yield topics like mediators of inflammation, types of granulomas, and wound healing phases. These are consistently tested.
Any final tips for our listeners?
Practice questions under timed conditions. It's not just about knowing the content, but also about quick recall and application.
What about stress management during preparation?
Regular practice with previous year questions builds confidence. The more familiar you are with the pattern, the less stressful the actual exam becomes.
How should they handle tough questions in the exam?
Use the elimination method. Even if you're not sure of the correct answer, you can often eliminate obviously wrong options.
What about guessing strategy?
If you can eliminate two options, it's worth making an educated guess. But be careful with negative marking.
How often should students review their progress?
Weekly self-assessment is ideal. Keep track of your accuracy in different subtopics to identify weak areas.
What's the best way to strengthen weak areas?
Focus on understanding the basic concepts first, then gradually move to more complex questions. Don't rush the process.
How important is group study for this topic?
It can be helpful for discussing complex concepts, but ensure you're also doing individual practice regularly.
Any last words of encouragement?
Remember, inflammation is a high-yield topic. Master it, and you've already secured a significant portion of your score.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. Remember, inflammation might be complex, but with the right approach, it can become your strongest subject.
Absolutely. And just like inflammation is your body's response to injury, let your preparation be your response to these challenging exams. Good luck, everyone.